Hello again. I'm Jim Dull, Professor of Political Science here at the University of New Haven, and this is Views from UNH, a program of discussions with members of the UNH community, largely faculty, but certainly administrators and others who are part of the community, including occasional guests. And the purpose is to provide an overview of some of the thinking on a university campus, and particularly this one. In featuring members of our faculty, try to remain relevant with what's happening in the world today, and nothing could be more important than the financial crisis which has bedeviled the world for about the last 4 years. And to comment on that from time to time, we've had one of our veteran members of our faculty, Professor Robert Rainish, to come in and join us for a discussion of the world economy and the economy in the United States. He's been with the university since 1976, and he's a professor in the College of Business, the Department of Finance. Bob, welcome to the program again.
Oh, thank you, Jim. Well, glad to be back.
And now, the last time we chatted, about a year ago, you had a fairly optimistic view of the development of the economy and the possibility of its recovery. And while it does seem to be a bit stalled, it nonetheless hasn't gotten any worse. As a matter of fact, just this morning on the day we're taping, there was a story in the New Haven Register indicating that in Connecticut, the unemployment rate has actually dropped to under 9%, and there are signs of progress. How do you see things in general happening in the United States in this last year?
The only surprise, in my view, was the political risk that just went sky high. Otherwise, the recovery is doing pretty much what you'd expect it to do. This is a different type of recovery. It's a credit recession recovery, and therefore it will be much more elongated, slow growth, but growth nevertheless.
Well, of course, the political tie-up in Washington has made it difficult to initiate any new governmental programs, and the development of the private sector is relatively slow, but it's being slowed further by developments in Europe. And again, as we're speaking this morning, a meeting of the European leaders has been delayed until the middle of next week, and there's no assurance of what kind of plan is going to come out of the European Union. A story this past week wondered whether the eurozone would even break up the European Union itself. How do you see their problems, the problems with Greece and potentially Italy and Spain? Are these solvable problems?
Yes, they're solvable. They have a greater problem than what we've ever actually faced because their governments overpromised benefits to their citizenry. Their politicians pandered to them to an extreme point in these various countries. And therefore they have to take them back. And thus you're seeing the strife in Greece when people lose benefits and their standards of living decline. It's part of this readjustment process. Has significant social value impacts. Will the eurozone break up? The answer really is no, because Germany is actually a benefactor of the eurozone. Their ability to export is tied to the euro-dollar, and the euro-dollar stays somewhat down, lower than otherwise would be the case, so they become a much more competitive global player.
Well, of course, we're affected because no matter how we define globalization, it seems that we're in a system in which many of the banks and many of the individuals in each country invest in each other's banks and in others' economies. And so the American risk in a Greek bankruptcy would be pretty disastrous, wouldn't it?
Actually, no.
Really?
Greece is really small. Greece is a $50 billion economy. And yesterday I heard an interview where every year 3 Greeces are created in China. So that when you look at it from a global perspective, Greece is really a small microcosm. What makes Greece so difficult is that it's tied to the eurozone, that it is the extreme player in terms of giving benefits. If you looked at what they gave their citizenry, it was enormously expensive. Lifetime employment in essence for all government workers, and the benefits involved. So they went to the extreme point. The idea is now, how do you bring them back to a rational economic system? So Greece itself isn't that great. The systemic risk is really in the European banks more than in the U.S. banks. You're correct. There is a systemic crossover because so much of finance is global. Money moves around. I lend you, you lend them, they come back, they lend me. So if you fail, they fail, I fail. So you can't eliminate that network structure. But it's the sovereign debt that is in Europe that is the major problem, and that's what they're trying to thrash out, is how are they going to do something similar to the TARP in the U.S. to get the banks stabilized.
They have a facility to which they've allocated about 400 billion euros, and it's estimated that they really need about 2 trillion euros to deal with Europe's problem. And undoubtedly that has to come mostly from France and Germany. And they can't seem to get their act together on what they're going to do.
That's right. It's a political problem. How do you tell your citizenry, well, you're going to write the credit line for Greece, who gives away money to its citizenry, and Italy, who just really doesn't get their economy growing, and to Spain and Portugal, who've overextended themselves, especially Spain in terms of the expansion with credit. So it's a tough political sell, but really what is called for is that basically France, Germany, and the rest simply say, look, they'll do a Bernanke, whatever it takes. If it takes 400 billion, that's fine. If it takes 2 trillion, that's fine. If it takes more than that to backstop it, we're going to stand behind it. And what that does is it takes away the fear factor, takes away the ability of traders to basically trade on fear.
You think, though, as you look at the attempt that they're trying to make, even though Germany has not yet seems committed fully to doing it thoroughly, that the facility they're trying to create is an effective mechanism to finance the restoration of confidence in the banks?
If it's not that mechanism, it will be another mechanism. Probably the most hair-pulling effect of everything, and obviously I don't have much hair to pull, but the most hair-pulling effect of what is taking place is that instead of addressing it, they have to do this political dance to get their citizenry to support it. The Greek debt crisis has been going on for close to a year, 6 to 12 months, and instead of confronting it, they've had to do this dance. Now that just ripples across the world because of this uncertainty. Nobody really can plan on next year's activities if you don't know what next year looks like. And that is probably the biggest stumbling block that we have. The same thing applies in the U.S. The political standoff is really a question of do something so that I can plan for the future. And that's what you probably hear from various business groups.
There don't seem to be any particularly insightful answers to all of this on a systemic basis. It seems that they're just scratching away, flying by the seat of their pants, trying to come up with workable ad hoc solutions that they think will moderate the damage. Whether these facilities are going to work is very questionable, because the theory is if the European facility were $2 trillion, then everybody would want a chunk of it. And rather than concentrating on the countries that need it the most, that everybody would want a piece. It's like a piece of either infrastructure legislation or subsidy legislation in the United States. When it's created for a particular purpose, everybody wants a chunk of it, and Congress comes up with a formula that designs distribution in which everybody gets a piece, whether they need it or not. And you wind up with bridges to nowhere. So it remains a question in my mind, looking at it from a political standpoint, as you are too, whether there is the ingenuity in Europe at the moment to be able to solve it long term, and that raises questions about the survival of the euro and the survival of the EU as an institution.
They have too much to lose not to solve it. How they solve it, it's either you can compare it to a sausage factory. What you put into a sausage and what comes out, you don't really want to know what goes in. You can look at it compared to the United States, where we have this political log rolling that takes place, which is to the detriment. That's part of the feelings that you get out of the citizenry in the United States, is they're fed up with that type of style. That was probably why the plan that Obama had put forward, gave it to Congress, and Congress put together a monstrosity to solve the problem, because the problem's going to take long time. It's a 5+ year solution from coming out of a credit crisis. And it's a question of how much social cost are you willing to bear? Do we want shanty towns, right? Because the last time this occurred was in the 1930s. You had shanty towns, bread lines, people selling apples on the streets, and so on. Is that an acceptable path, or is a path where you have a social safety net, and then the question is, how big a social safety net?
Exactly, and what you're saying is represented in an item in the New Haven Register this morning as we speak. Half of all U.S. workers earn under $26,364 a year. And that contrasts, of course, with the upper 1% of the population who are making gigantic salaries and benefits from the economy. The growing disparity between the wealthy and the workers has been a problem in this country for at least the last 30 to 40 years, and it represents part of our financial difficulty now. The political battle, as you've suggested, indicates that we're not really very clear about how we get out of all of this, how we, A, pay off some of the national debt, and how we continue to provide for social welfare legislation as well as infrastructure. What do you see the possibilities of this in the next year?
If you have great hope, you hope that the politicians get a little dose of reality and do what's needed. That's if you're optimistic, and one would hope that that'll take place. Otherwise, we'll just keep on stumbling along with this path. But if you look at what we have a growing economy. Is it growing as fast as you would expect from a credit recession? We're probably leaving up to a 1% growth because of the unnecessary uncertainty. Is government really the solution? The government can put some of the pieces in place. The U.S. Jobs Council, headed by Immelt, put out a nice document talking about what is needed to rebuild America. And we need a better educated workforce. We need better infrastructure and so on. These things are necessary. The bifurcation of this economy between the ones who are growing and the ones who are just stagnating, that's really a question of social mobility and economic mobility. And part of what has been lost in the United States has been a reduction of that mobility, the ability to move up. And the way you do it is you have to educate your workforce, because there are jobs. Jobs are being created, but they're higher skilled jobs. They're human capital based jobs. There are jobs in energy, but we have this conflict of what is allowed in terms of energy. But I can be very optimistic in those things. If we allowed energy jobs to grow, if we use the oil shale that's in North Dakota, or in gas shale that's in Pennsylvania, the oil shale, gas shale that's in Texas. You do it with appropriate regulation, but you grow it, and a lot of them are engineers as well as skilled laborers. So you might absorb a significant number from the construction industry because they are a major difficulty in the United States. 2 to 3 million individuals involved in real estate, construction, and so on pretty much represent the long-term unemployed.
As the nature of economies change, clearly the government does have a major role in this. And this is, unfortunately, part of our deep national divide has to do with the appropriate role of government. That's made the present governmental stalemate a real drag on economic development. Uncertainty for the corporate world, certainly a lot of pain for the unemployed world. In this political stalemate, can you see any solution at all before the end of the electoral cycle, until the 2012 election takes place?
To be honest with you, I think if I were to come back next year, but the end of November instead of the beginning of November, the likelihood is we're going to be relatively in the same place in terms of the political standoff. Some small things will have occurred that will be positive, but the general momentum of the economy will probably be the same. Jobs are being created, business. If I were to just simply truncate out the sectors of the economy that are doing poorly, and they're not really going to come back very strongly, and that's housing, anything to do with real estate and housing, and I leave the rest of it will continue to grow. It's just not as robust as one would like.
Of course, now that we're into the discussion of the electoral cycle and the fascinating primary system that's underway among the Republicans, most notable is the idea of the 999 program that has come up in recent weeks. And there's been a good deal of discussion about its viability as a genuine economic strategy. What do you make of it?
Somebody actually did a study of it. It's basically a transfer of wealth and income from the bottom half to the top half. Whether or not it's, in terms of political sense, whether or not it's going to sell once that becomes known, I don't know about that. It could generate as much revenue as you want because you just gear up. And if it's not 999, 10, 10, 10. But it's basically doesn't provide for the needs that we truly do need, and that's building infrastructure and an educated workforce and investment in science and some investment. Andy Grove of Intel talks about scaling up ideas, and the U.S. does a miserable job of scaling up ideas, and that's all political. These are questions of what is the role of government, and the government at this point is in a standoff stage. It's a stalemate. So I don't know what it's really terrible.
Well, I'm sure from the perspective of finance, it's a very unsettling time because it's so unpredictable. From the standpoint of a political scientist, it seems that there is no solution until after the next election at best, and the determination of the control of the next Congress. Because this Congress is apparently not going to get anything done that satisfies either political party. The Republican Party has taken a position of total opposition to any initiatives proposed by President Obama, and the president can't seem to accept some of the basic demands that the Republicans believe are necessary for the economy. So, stalemate. And it seems to me that the next election is going to have to determine the direction of policy over the next 4 years.
I don't, to be honest with you, I think that stalemate will continue until such time as the leaders in both parties decide to come to a solution. The grand design that was proposed by Boehner and Obama that they were talking about would have moved the ball forward and have partially to mostly solved what is needed. But it was unacceptable to both parties' extremes.
Now, Bob, a lot of the argument is over the idea of reducing the national debt, and the question of what is an appropriate level of national debt. Is $14 trillion too much of a national debt for an economy our size? And how do you economists determine this? How do you decide what is adequate, what is fair, what is reasonable, and what is too much?
It's the ability to pay without impacting your long-term growth prospects. And that, and the level at 14 trillion today isn't really the issue. It's what will it be 5, 10 years down the road. And that's why the plan, the grand design plan, was an attempt to reduce the trajectory of growth of expenditures, and it would have been able to then stabilize the level of debt. Not the dollars of debt, it's the percentage of debt of the economy. And that is really the target that needs to be addressed. It's not the amount of debt.
There seems to be, however, a lot of concern about the amount itself as being, let's say, a debt that's the size of the gross national product. Is that a reasonable measure of what is too much debt?
That's probably reaching the limits. And that's why you grow the economy and you cut the trajectory down and you remain below 100%. And if you do this over a longer period of time, the level of debt as a percentage of the economy will actually go down. And this is pretty much what takes place in a credit recession, is that in a credit recession, the private sector overextends itself, and then the government sector steps in to support the economy to some degree, but it's then at that juncture that the government sector has to put in place the long-term structural components so that the economy will grow robustly and bring everything and make it stabilized.
Bob, earlier you mentioned the systemic problem, the demand for social welfare services vis-a-vis the aggregate wealth that a country can produce, and the inevitable conflict that can occur and does occur there. How do we deal with that in the long term? Not only the United States, but every country in the world.
I'll go back to something that was discussed many years ago. John F. Kennedy wrote Profiles of Courage. I think many of these politicians need a profile of courage moment where they step forward and do what's necessary for society, recognizing, rationalizing, however you want to call it, what benefits can be paid, what benefits can't be paid, and what processes will they be used.
Isn't there a responsibility on the part of the private leadership of especially the huge banking system leaders, to exercise some responsibility here? It seems that in reading Alan Greenspan's book, he expressed great confidence that the leaders of the financial system would take care that the markets would not get out of hand, and that didn't happen, for which he's been occasionally apologizing since. Is there any way that one can expect that this kind of leadership responsibility will be available?
You're talking about systemic risks growing out of businesses. And when it comes to the financial system, you really need regulators to prevent that enormous systemic risk from growing up. That's the failure of Greenspan, recognizing the behavioral aspects of a system versus, quote, the rational expectations of a system. A market system is behavioralistic. It is not a rational system, in which case you'll get extreme points. And these extreme points can be quite catastrophic to a society, as we've just watched, 2007, 2008, where debt was lent out in various areas, but it doesn't really matter. It's still systemic, and if it's systemic to a certain point, it will then lead to a catastrophic event.
Well, very briefly, is the Dodd-Frank approach going to be adequate to provide reinvigorated regulation that can bring better balance?
If it's written properly, it will bring some balance. But over time, markets evolve, and you always have to be diligent. You have to be vigilant on how they behave, because they will evolve, and therefore regulation has to evolve with it.
I mean, individual, personal, social, and corporate responsibility are not enough.
You're talking to the wrong person here when it comes to that. Businesses are here to create wealth, and the outcome of their creating wealth are jobs. And it's a requirement of government and society to create an environment where it can prosper. And if it does, everybody wins.
Well, your argument for a better effective partnership is certainly in place and needed. I want to thank you for coming in again, Bob, to talk about the economy. It's a constantly evolving problem, and we'll talk about it again at another time and do a reassessment sometime down the line. This has been Views from UNH. I'm Jim Dull. Join us again next time for Views from UNH.